Hello everybody, here's Tony Gosling. He's going to talk to us today about the revolutionary potential of journalism. His background, he started out in community radio, spent some time at the BBC. He was very involved in the launch of The Land Is Ours and did that for some time. And after a period doing independent work, he's now actually with Russia Today. But he's here to talk about journalism.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I thought I'd start by one of the basic, simple tips of journalism. I think it's probably better to contextualise this whole thing about journalism being revolutionary. This is a quote from George Orwell. George Orwell saying, you know, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And I think that really is where we are in Britain today. It's a very sad thing to say, but journalism is in a diabolical state. Just as one example of how you can actually measure how bad things are, over the last couple of years that have got I've found fascinating in one way or another, that kind of make you question the official version of history. We'll start in September 1944, right, during the Second World War. The Battle of Arnhem. This was a parachute invasion of Holland. It was the liberation of Holland. But all sorts of very weird things happened during that attack. It was right at the very end of the Second World War, towards the end anyway. And there's a lot of evidence that the British and the Americans were already doing deals with the Nazis, because the Nazis knew they were going to lose, and they were thinking, well, how are we going to do some deals? And also, how are we going to delay the end of the war so that we can get all of our loot that we've looted from all over Europe out of Berlin and secrete it around the world? And Operation Market Gardens really, I found fascinating, because the Dutch liaison officer that was in Britain, that was doing the liaison between the Dutch resistance on the ground and the British forces as they were about to parachute into Arnhem, Nijmegen. Has anyone seen the film A Bridge Too Far? Yeah, because that film really is the film of the battle. And it's quite clear if you look at it that this guy who was doing the liaison, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, was actually a former SS officer before the war. And there he is in Whitehall with all our army, etc., peering over the top of the plans of Monty and I think it was General Horrocks, one of the generals who was involved in the invasion. There's actually photographs of him looking over their shoulder, looking at the maps of the plan of the invasion. So anyway, the whole thing was a disaster. It ended up being a disaster. But later it was found out that the secret agent that was sent in by Bernhard to contact all the resistance in Holland, right across Holland, this guy, he was called Christian Lindemans, who was nicknamed King Kong, turned out he was a German agent. Instead of when they got him into Holland, instead of going to make contact with all of the resistance movements, he went straight to the Nazis with all the information about the plans for the invasion of Holland. So you can see there's some pretty high level dodgy stuff going on there. This then leads on in another thing I've looked at over the years, something called the Bilderberg conferences. Because Prince Bernhard, the guy who I was just talking about, was this Dutch liaison officer with the British in the invasion of Holland that was such a disaster. He ended up 10 years later in the same spot, Oosterbeek in Holland, chairing the first Bilderberg conference. I think also worth mentioning one book which I've read over the last couple of years, which has really changed my view of the post-war world. And if you don't read anything else, it's available free online, or you can buy it. I think on most of these sort of book sites. It's called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and it was written by a guy called Paul Manning. Paul Manning was CBS's news correspondent in Europe during World War II. Now, he was doing things like flying in American aircraft that were bombing Germany during the war. And he was doing those reports back to millions of people in the US. So he was one of the key people sort of telling the Americans what was going on in Europe. And afterwards, he became, some might say, obsessed with tracing what had happened to all the loot the Nazis had looted from Europe at the end of the war. And he traced a lot of it back to Argentina. But he also discovered that one of the key figures who had their hands on the Nazi bank accounts, Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's secretary, his death had been faked, very crudely, not very well, but he'd spent about 20 years actually over in South America, living in South America, and he documents all of this. And what Bormann was up to when he was over in South America was setting up companies. He was a bureaucratic guy. He was setting up companies in European countries and in the United States and Canada and places like that. He set up 750 corporations, and the money was laundered. The loot from the war was laundered mostly through this New York law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, which was connected with the Dulles brothers, who were another dodgy couple of, well, extremely dodgy. I mean, they were Nazis before the war, but then they became after the war. The Dulles brothers, one was Secretary of State in the US, and the other one was head of the CIA. They were doing all sorts of really dodgy stuff, and they'd been friendly with the Nazis before the war anyway. So Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, really explains how the Nazis got this loot, and they got all these guys who'd been in the SS or been supporters of the SS during the war, and they just took off their uniforms, put on nice suits, and made them directors of these companies. Now, quite where those companies are now, God only knows. But certainly there are some figures, for example, connected with the Bilderberg Conference, the families were involved, and you can read about them in his book, in the immediate post-war world, in helping launder all this loot. I mean, we don't hear the question, do we, very often, what did happen to all the loot from the war? Because everywhere the Nazis went, they brought everything back to Berlin. But where did it all go? When the Russians got to Berlin, it had gone. So, I mean, personally, I think quite a lot of it was Spain, quite a lot was Switzerland, but certainly a lot in Argentina. I mean, they had their own Nazi party going on in Argentina through the war anyhow. And I've been in touch with a journalist called Lawrence de Mello over there. She's British, and she's worked for Discovery Channel and things like that. But she entertains me. You know, she said, well, when I first arrived in Buenos Aires, it was like everyone's talking about the Nazis next door. It's all just normal over here. They're everywhere. But, of course, they don't wear the swastikas. They just have that attitude, and they wear suits and ties, and they're all very polite now.